To the public. What happened? Oh, okay. This is Alan Alexandrov, the director of the Global Summitry Project. I'm reporting to you from St. Petersburg and the Media Center at the St. Petersburg Summit. It's my pleasure to introduce to you this afternoon a colleague from the University of British Columbia and the director of the Institute of Asian Research, Dr. Yves Tiberghien. Yves?
Hello, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Alan.
So I wanted to make sure that we got an opportunity to talk to you before the final communique from the St. Petersburg summit comes out, which is probably in a few hours. So let me start by asking you, what has surprised you about the this summit as opposed to the Los Cabos summit in Mexico, which you also attended?
There's several differences or surprises. The first one is, of course, not just the Cabos, but also the Cannes summit. Were actually both dominated by the Euro crisis, and by Greece in particular. They both had a cliffhanger Greek election or referendum, just before or just during. This case, we don't have a European crisis. In a way, Europe is in a quiet moment. And in fact, we could go further. Europe has almost disappeared. We don't hear that much about Europe. They are not speaking in a unified way, and there is not a strong, agenda coming from Europe. So that's definitely one big difference. Another big difference is, of course, that for the first time we got a security question that has erupted onto the G20 scene, which is supposed to be reserved for global economic management, and of course that is the Syria question. And so it has, even though it's not on the agenda officially, and is not part of the core documents and the core work of the G20, it has dominated some of the attention of the leaders, and as we know, much of the dinner last night. So that's also first. I don't know if that means that the G20 will follow the way that the G8 has gone, moving from economy to security. But in this case, there was just urgency, and that's what happened. Another difference, I think, is, well, the early G20s were dominated by US, Europe, and so in a way the developed countries. I think that the core axis, from what we see cited in this G20 is really between the US on one side and the BRICS countries on the other side. I think we see a bit more importance given to the BRICS summit. There are lots of official photos, because it's hosted for the first time by a BRICS country. And we find that also a bit more voice coming from China. We have seen that the press conference and the comments by the Vice Minister of Finance yesterday were really dominated some of the news coverage of day one, and I don't think we've seen this much before. And finally, we could say that, until even Cabos, there was still a bit of leftover of the early G20 atmosphere of thinking big about global governance, about reshaping, new Bretton Woods. That gradually went away, and in this summit is much more low-key. It's more working summit, picking up files and working groups. So while on one hand the working groups are busy producing more and more documents, and there's a long list of working papers and really interesting documents, on the other hand we have much less of a grand framework about changing global governance and in a big way. So it's a bit more low-key working meeting, a bit more routinized in its own focus on the global economy.
Yves, that's very interesting, but let me take you back to the first point you were making, which related to Syria. What influence do you think this intrusion of a security issue, in particular the Syria question and potential American action, might have on the summit itself?
Well, I see it as a negative, because on one hand, the G20 cannot solve the Syria question. It's not the right forum. There's different issues here. Number one, there's core entrenched interests and a clash of interests between Russia and the US and some Europeans. And they cannot be bridged in any conceivable way right now. Because the only way to bridge it would be having Russia, in a way, reduce or drop its support for the Assad regime, which is seen as an old sphere of influence, in exchange for the Western powers giving more time to the UN Security Council. But we cannot imagine Russia taking that first step. And so things are deadlocked, and however much they talk here, it's not going to help. Besides, too many countries are taken for the ride when they don't have much influence over the question. So you're occupying, leaders' time for something that's unsolvable with the wrong group of countries. And besides, since it's going to be, but more or less a deadlock, it has negative influence on the image of the G20. The only hope is that the host has called for a meeting of foreign ministers after the G20 ends, so about 4 or 5 p.m. today. And that maybe they will be able to work on a roadmap on how to proceed moving forward, and that we can assume that the host still has an interest in making sure that this G20 is not seen as a total failure, and therefore trying to do some progress on the Syria question. But it can really be done only by foreign ministers, mostly of some countries, not all countries. So I just hope that it doesn't detract the attention and the leaders from the real work of the G20, which is to build global rules, global coordination for the global economy. And those tasks are very, very important. The global economy is in a very fragile state, under-institutionalized state. And if that work doesn't continue for the next 5-10 years, we could very well see a collapse of globalization.
I appreciate those comments. I guess, notwithstanding, we're not there at the communique yet, but maybe you can give us some of your thoughts, and hopefully we'll be able to come back to you once the communique is released. But looking towards the communique, I wonder if you can, at this point, make some assessment of what you think might be described as either the success or the failure of this particular summit.
So there would be some deliverables, right? And so while, of course, the media attention may not focus on those, they will focus more at the hot-button questions of Syria and other. The deliverables that are coming represent a lot of work that have been going on for the whole year, and particularly on issues like taxation and increased sharing of information and transparency on taxation, which could lead over time, if it's pursued, to an end to the erosion of the tax bases in key countries, and to greater sense of social justice. So it turns into a democracy question. So it's very, very important. That's one. There is definite progress coming out of the FSB on the regulation of derivatives, and the gradual move to a more transparent follow-up, and move to exchange, to more transparent exchange of derivatives. That's very, very important. There is progress on Basel III. There is progress, reflection on shadow banking. Too big to fail. I think we are about to see some major milestones and announcements. So there's a series, all those agendas essentially that are inherited by the G20 since 2008, 2009, are all progressing. And so while they may not be up to the scale of what is necessary to fully prevent a future crisis, they actually represent accumulation of coordination, regulation, which is meaningful. We can also expect something on the regulation of energy, or at least more information, more follow-up, more transparency on energy markets. And itself, that's the first step toward the consolidation of the energy markets, which are critical for the future of globalization. So all those steps are important. I think that's where the attention should focus, rather than Syria. And so there is, in a sense, a process where G20 is still delivering some output, some coordination, and some global regulations toward global governance.
Dave, it was a pleasure to talk with you, and hopefully we'll be able to come back to you after the communique to talk about a kind of final assessment as to the success or failure of this particular G20 summit. Thanks again, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure.